Welcome, everybody, to today's Specialty in General Psychiatry Division Academic Rounds. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Joel Dimsdale. Dr. Dimsdale is Regent Edward A. Dickinson Emeritus Professor, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry. And I was reading through his CV, and it is so impressive how many achievements you have. I think you all received the newsletter and can go in more details. I just want to point out that Dr. Dimsdale has also written, extensively published and written books that are of great interest to me and to many other people, like Anatomy of Malice, The Enigma of the Nazi War Criminals. And I think his knowledge and his skills are so broad. And today he is talking about something that is of interest to all of us, the psychiatry's experience with psychedelics, the Cold War years. Please, Dr. Dimsdale.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you all for tuning in this morning across Zoom. If you get a chance to turn your cameras on, it's always easier to see faces and know whether I'm putting people to a restful sleep or not. When I retired about 10 or 12 years ago, I was smitten by an interest in the history of our field. And as Andres said, I've pursued this in a couple of ways. You know, psychiatry and psychology are always at the cutting edge of cultural, societal, neuroscience, behavior. Everything's going on in that space. And what I'd like to do today is to talk about a curious bit of history. You know, today we're very interested in the use of psychedelics in psychiatry and psychology. But it may surprise some of you to learn that our initial experience with psychedelics developed in the shadows of World War II and flourished during the Cold War years. I more or less fell into this topic as I began working on the history of brainwashing. Let me see if I can share my screen. So I'm going to start this lecture in an unorthodox manner by starting with my conclusions and then showing you how I came to them. Never forget that the goals and interests of the investigator are not totally in sync with the funding agency. The donor always has an agenda. Be very alert to the ethical implications of your studies. Otherwise, there can be absolutely stunningly disastrous consequences. Consider how experimental design influences your conclusions, and be ready to admit that enthusiasm is a two-edged sword. When your favored hypotheses are not supported, it takes true courage to abandon course. And do keep in mind that much of medicine is serendipity. Not only are discoveries unpredictable, but newly discovered drugs get repurposed, and odd links in personal history go on to make an enormous impact. Our story really begins back in 1938, when Albert Hofmann accidentally discovered LSD and considered it a curiosity. But think for a moment what was going on in Europe in the late 30s and 40s. During World War II, both Nazi Germany and the Allies began thinking that consciousness-altering drugs might be useful in interrogating the enemy. Thus, LSD and its congeners were no longer just a curiosity. In Dachau, the SS wondered whether mescaline could be used to interrogate captured enemy soldiers or spies. They surreptitiously spiked inmates' coffee with mescaline and observed their responses. Some became giddy, some angry, and some drowsy. They then interrogated the prisoners and found that they talked carelessly and openly. They questioned the prisoners about their sexual fantasies and also what the prisoners really thought about the guards. But the conclusion was that decent persons remained decent during the examination, but mental restraints hardly occurred. Sentiments of hatred and revenge were revealed in every case. Nonetheless, they weren't satisfied with mescaline's potential military use, noting that it's impossible to impose one's own will on another person, even when the strongest doses of mescaline had been given.
Oh, it sounds
While
like
the Nazis were studying mescaline, the United States convened a special panel to study drugs for interrogating POWs. The group included prominent academics, intelligence agency officers, and somewhat surprisingly, Anslinger, who was the first commission of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger's membership on the commission is all the more curious given its tentative endorsement of marijuana as a potential drug for interrogation. Many people in this Zoom room today may assume that LSD appeared in the 1960s as a manifestation of popular culture. Timothy Leary, Baba Ram Dass, the Beatles, Woodstock, etc. From this popular culture perspective, LSD use was a fad that came into fashion in the late 60s and drifted out of fashion by 2002, and then started coming back into fashion in 2008, and really started coming into fashion 10 years later, until psychedelics were sold semi-publicly or outright legalized today. Today, we see a very welcome interest in clinical trials examining the utility of psychedelics. But this narrative from pop culture, fads of usage, and emerging interests in clinical trials ignores entirely how the Cold War contributed to a very different view of psychedelics as weapons. Intelligence agencies became obsessed with LSD as a tool for extracting memories. Today, I'll summarize two lethal experiments in the United States and Canada, and a nightmarish set of studies that bear a surprising resemblance to the Jason Bourne thrillers. While I'm glad this chapter is behind us, we mustn't forget how psychiatry participated in this research. Following Stalin's show trials and the recriminations about the Korean War POWs, the United States was determined to mount a brain war offensive. CIA Director Alan Dulles laid out the challenge. The Russians take selected human beings and turn them into humble confessors of crimes they never committed. New techniques wash the brain clean of the thoughts and create new processes and new thoughts. Thus, the fear was there and the political posturing was there, but there was very little science to move the field forward. Thus, the CIA turned to academia to explore the riddle of persuasion and memory. Grants to some 80 universities poured in from the CIA, principally through the MK Ultra program, which flourished in the 1950s and 60s. Called by some the Manhattan Project of the Mind, these various programs spent billions of dollars in clandestine studies that focused on behavior control, social influence, and propaganda. In addition to government agencies, private foundations also supported research, and many of them were covertly funded by the government. Cornell's Institute for Social Ecology was one of the key players for transferring CIA funds to university researchers across the United States. Its origins reveal an extraordinary backstory. And again, I alluded to the issues of serendipity. It turned out that CIA Director Dulles' son, Alan Dulles Jr., was badly wounded in the Korean War and came home disabled from a head injury. Dulles turned to Cornell neurologist Harold Wolff to care for his son. Wolff tried to help rehabilitate the wounded Dulles and gave him various odd jobs in his department. Wolff had already been vetted by the CIA because of his service during World War II. He was one of America's most prominent neurologists and had personally studied with Pavlov in Russia. He was an expert in headaches and the subtle interplay of brain and behavior, editor-in-chief of Archives of Neurology, president of the American Neurological Association. Wolff was a broad thinker, a riveting lecturer, and a caring physician who was convinced that stress and emotional response influenced the course of most diseases. He was also described as austere, autocratic, humorless, and fiercely competitive, who could be quite intimidating. Wolff had a one-track mind about work, so much so that his colleagues commented, if a dog came in and threw up on the rug during one of his lectures, Wolff would continue. Dulles was grateful to Wolff for treating his son and offered to support Wolff's research if he would help identify other researchers who might be able to advance the CIA's research agenda. Wolff turned to his colleague Larry Hinkle, professor of medicine at Cornell, to help establish the Institute of Social Ecology. I knew Larry. He was a big, gruff, sardonic man who had no tolerance for fools and carried himself with a military bearing. But behind that exterior, he had a delightfully warm, if peppery, sense of humor. Hinkle was a brilliant internist who made major contributions in cardiovascular epidemiology. Like Wolff, he was convinced that stress was potentially deadly, and thus he emphasized the importance of studying disease in the context of the social environment. So the name social ecology refers to studies of how humans relate to their social environment, except that in this instance, Cornell's Institute on Social Ecology supported research on unusual environments where interrogation, brainwashing, and LSD might coerce secrets from the enemy. The Institute funded a vast portfolio of research on LSD, sensory deprivation, and isolation until 1965. Hinkle became progressively disillusioned with the Institute, complaining that the CIA was increasingly in the driver's seat and interested in their own operational problems, not in basic research and human ecology. Furthermore, he had reservations about some of the CIA staff detailed to the Institute, and he resigned from the board. A letter from intelligence operative George White to Dr. Wolff perfectly encapsulates Hinkle's concerns about the agency men they were working with. White wrote, "What's the possibility of working out a graph indicating the state of panic of the enemy based upon varying degree of pressure used?" To which Wolf replied smoothly, "Yours is a very provocative notion, and I'm sure it could be documented. Warm regards." So who was playing whom? Was the CIA using an innocent, naive academic to pursue agency objectives, or were the academics steering the agency where they wanted to go? Obviously, it depends upon the details of each collaboration. But Harold Wolf was no shrinking wallflower, no pawn at all. When Cornell, years later, started to assess the checkered history of the Institute, the committee commented ruefully how forceful Wolf was. While the liaison between CIA and Cornell was the most notorious front for supporting brainwashing research, the CIA had relationships with several foundations as well. The Macy Foundation, yes, the same Macy Foundation that has supported many people today, they were a front at that time and had interests in neuroscience, wartime psychiatry, and LSD. All of these interests were closely aligned with the agency's brainwashing portfolio. Macy supported Harold Abramson, an early pioneer in LSD research. Abramson reported that under LSD, his psychotherapy patients started revealing material they hadn't previously disclosed. The CIA wasn't particularly interested in new techniques in psychotherapy, but was very intrigued to learn that LSD might facilitate disclosing information. When I worked at the Macy archives, looking at their closed meetings on LSD, I saw the refreshingly candid discussions of the unbridled enthusiasm about LSD and a belief that there could be disbelief that there could be any adverse effects. Nonetheless, some attendees acknowledged that they like to have sedatives on hand for certain patients, and one disclosed the terror he felt when he was first dosed by accident. Charles Geschickter, a name certainly unique, provided another unlikely source of funds for CIA behavioral research. On the face of it, he was a prominent Georgetown University pathologist who studied breast cancer. However, he also funneled funds from the CIA into the Geschickter Foundation. These funds supported studies of interrogation and use of LSD in prisoners. Geschickter funded the LSD research by Harold Abramson in New York and Jolly West, then in Oklahoma. The foundation's other interests including discovering toxic compounds in mushrooms and ways of incapacitating people or inducing sleep. When the scandal about the CIA's research eventually broke, a Senate committee interviewed Dr. Geschickter about his foundation's involvement with the CIA. Senator Kennedy asked why the CIA wished to have a hospital-based safe house at Georgetown to conduct research. Geschickter replied evasively, "I haven't the slightest idea." He attributed it to the university's sloppy bookkeeping and claimed he couldn't remember. In fact, the agency was studying emotional stress, working on knockout drops, searching for compounds to trigger toxic psychosis, studying how amnesia could be induced by concussions, and using radar to cause sleep. The last study, Geschickter acknowledged, he did remember noting that radar really worked, but that the dose was tricky. If you gave too much radar, you injured the heat center of the brain, the way you cook meat. Numerous universities accepted funds from MK Ultra through one funnel or another. And when this information emerged in the 60s and 70s, there was outrage, perhaps a degree of outrage that's hard to understand today. Those of us with gray hair or no hair remember those days vividly. Then we were mired in the Vietnam War and had a visceral wariness of authority. CIA, military, Nixon, assassination conspiracy was one giant monster, and those associated with any of it were distrusted. Some of the MK Ultra sponsored research richly deserved this notoriety, but there's no sin to receiving research support from the CIA. The issue has to do with the details of the research and the strings attached to the funding. Some researchers proposed questionable studies. Harold Wolff's proposal still makes one gasp decades later. Potentially useful secret drugs and various brain-damaging procedures will be tested in order to ascertain their fundamental effect upon brain function, mood, thought, behavior. As these drugs are investigated, a concurrent search for antidotes or countermeasures will be also conducted. This is scary enough, but the next sentence in the proposal is horrifying. Where any of these studies involve potential harm to the subject, we expect the agency to make available suitable subjects and a proper place for the performance of necessary experiments. In other words, Wolff was saying that when he anticipates harming a subject, he expected the agency to provide a suitable victim, a place to do the experiments, and by implication, to dispose of the subject afterwards. The CIA's portfolio on hallucinogens was classified, vast. It included projects that attempted to define the effective dose of LSD, how it could be surreptitiously administered, whether it could trigger psychosis or incapacitate or embarrass a government leader. MK Ultra studies examined if one could develop tolerance for LSD or if an antidote could be effective. Harvard's Henry Beecher wondered if LSD could be slipped into a military target, like a battleship, or for that matter, a city's water supply. Facing backlash from the public, the agency started cutting back on the LSD projects because it had experimented on unsuspecting subjects who had never volunteered. Throughout the United States, unwary people found themselves surreptitiously dosed, and the results were varyingly hilarity, enlightenment, panic, psychosis, and suicide. One former victim described his experience as an uninformed subject. I didn't know what I was getting into. We kept getting handed a glass of what looked like water. Drink it, they said, and then blam, I don't know what. The roof and the sky exploded. Crazy things happened. I mean, really crazy, like not real, but happening. It was like I was in a jungle someplace with wild animals all around me, all these crazy beasts trying to kill me. One of the CIA's most colorful agents, George White, worked on many LSD projects with MK Ultra and Harold Abramson. A colleague described him saying, George could charm the hide off a rabid dog. He was an old school OSS agent whose rough and tumble persona appealed to the shady side of American academic scientists. In White's notorious Midnight Climax project, he rented an apartment on Telegraph Hill. I showed this contemporary picture. And he hired prostitutes to slip LSD into their customers' drinks to see if they would confide information more readily. One CIA agent disclosed, if we were scared enough of a new compound not to try it on ourselves, we sent it to San Francisco, where White would experiment with it. They tried aerosolized LSD at a party in Marin County, but it was all for naught. The wind dispersed the drug. The various safe house escapades surreptitiously drugged people and observed their responses off and on for 14 years. News of this program eventually leaked out, and at a Senate hearing in the 1970s, Senator Kennedy lambasted the program. Certainly no one would question the need for drug experimentation, but no one should experience what we've heard in terms of the gross misrepresentation about potential side effects, the complete failure of notification of those who participated. They were completely unprepared to cope with these tragic after effects. The MK Ultra program administrator, Sidney Gottlieb on the left, was a brilliant, eccentric PhD chemist. To his colleagues, Gottlieb was affectionately known as the Beast or Merlin. He has been compared to Q in the James Bond series and less charitably viewed as a mad scientist. Gottlieb was introduced to LSD in 1951 by Dr. Abramson on the right, and consequently, Gottlieb personally experimented with the drug many times, but he didn't just experiment on himself. When he was in his office, he routinely slipped LSD and other drugs into his staff's food, drinks, or cigarettes. Frequently, he described the results as interesting or enchanting, but sometimes bad trips ensued. One surreptitiously dosed CIA agent fled the building in terror and reported that every automobile that came by was a terrible monster with fantastic eyes. It was hours of agony. It was like a dream that never stops, with someone always chasing you. The effect of LSD varies greatly depending on the setting in which it's taken. In the early days, when it was administered as an adjunct to psychotherapy, therapists reported that bad trips were rare and that the drug promoted insight and euphoria. On the other hand, when LSD was administered in threatening surroundings, or worse yet, surreptitiously, terror ensued. John Lennon and his wife Cynthia went to a dinner party where their host spiked their coffee with LSD. Cynthia reports John was crying and banging his head against the wall. I tried to make myself sick and throw up, and I couldn't. I tried to go to sleep, and I couldn't. It was like a nightmare that nothing could stop. It lasted for days. Gottlieb tried to explain the rationale of all this to Congress. He said, in the judgment of the CIA, there was tangible evidence that both the Soviets and the Red Chinese might be using techniques of altering human behavior, which we did not understand and which would have implications for national survival. We attempted to harness the academic and research community to provide badly needed answers. I considered all of this work to be extremely unpleasant, extremely difficult, sensitive, but above all else, to be extremely urgent. I'd like to describe two of what Dr. Gottlieb described as extremely unpleasant studies, in this case with lethal effects. When I was a resident at MGH, I was fortunate to work with Chester Pierce. This tall, graying, African-American psychiatrist, radiated humor, gentle warmth, and pragmatism. He was a font of stoic wisdom. I say all this not just to remember a beloved friend and mentor, but also to put in context the strange story he told me one day. Did I ever tell you the time when Jolly West and I killed an elephant in Oklahoma? Dr. Pierce and I had been talking about the capriciousness of funding, our careers, and the many blind alleys of research. It was a typical conversation about one of his favorite topics, the unpredictability of life and the necessity of humility, at least until he brought up the elephant. Jolly West was one of the leading military psychiatrists to study Korean War POWs. He continued to study issues of interest to the military and received funding from MK Ultra's various foundations. While governments wanted to know if LSD could accelerate interrogation, scientists wondered if such drugs could be a model for understanding psychosis or if they could stimulate creativity. In fact, the whole field of psychiatry was mesmerized by the drug. How could a minute dose so profoundly disrupt attention and perception? What might that tell us about the origins of schizophrenia? The CIA wasn't particularly interested in the neurobiology of schizophrenia, but was very interested in drugs that might affect thinking and agitation. So now the elephant. Male Asian elephants go through recurring bouts of musth once or twice a year, during which they become exceedingly aggressive. Oklahoma City had a zoo with a 14-year-old elephant named Tusco. Could LSD elicit a musk-like behavior in Tusco, and could that teach us something about agitation? Thus, Jolly, Chet, and a veterinarian, Warren Thomas, designed their elephant experiment. On the day before administering LSD, they shot Tusco with a dart containing penicillin as a kind of placebo control. The elephant looked up in surprise, trumpeted in protest, was restless for 2 or 3 minutes before returning to his typical day. The next day, they planned to give him LSD, but how much LSD? They already knew that a dose of 0.1 milligram could trigger hallucinations in humans, but no one had the slightest idea how much to give an elephant. You can't assume that because an elephant weighs 30 times as much as a human, that the dose would be 30 times longer. That's because species metabolize drugs differently. They shot Tusco with a dart containing about 3,000 times the human dose. And they described what happened in an article in Science. Tusco began trumpeting and rushing around the pen. However, this time his restlessness appeared to increase for 3 minutes after the injection. Then he stopped running and showed signs of marked incoordination. He began to sway, his hindquarters buckled, and it became increasingly difficult for him to maintain himself upright. 5 minutes later, he collapsed. I located Jolly West's private diary, and West described how incredulous he felt while watching Tusco die. I just shot him with the LSD. He whirled around to face the source of attack. He is very aggravated, very restless, and running around trying to shake the syringe out. Judy, his companion elephant, seems to be making an effort to comfort him. She's brought some food over to him and put it down to him in a way that she knows from experience would interest him. West concluded his diary entry writing, "Elephants can be said to possess a fantastic sensitivity of the central nervous system to LSD, and this may suggest something about the chemical nature of the annual phenomenon of musth." It was a harebrained study to determine if drugs could elicit psychotic-like behaviors. The study was designed by brilliant people with good intentions. It brought us no closer to understanding the biological basis of schizophrenia or the induction or treatment of agitation. The agency wasn't bashful about testing LSD on humans. I wish I could have said testing it on human volunteers, but there was very little volunteering, and there were lethal consequences. In the 1960s, there was wild enthusiasm for LSD as an adjunct for psychotherapy and personal growth. Abramson was one of its earliest boosters. He knew about the risks of surreptitiously dosing people with LSD, given his first experience with the drug. He had been working in the laboratory when he accidentally exposed himself to the drug. He wrote about it in his diary. Subsequently, I was confused and thought I was going to die. I started thinking of my life insurance premiums, and I was really upset. Then, once he realized that this was all due to inadvertent exposure to LSD, he thought, well, this is nothing. I'll be over this in a few hours, and I went to sleep. Abramson continued to evangelize about the drug, poo-pooing the dangers and claiming that he had never seen an adverse effect. The most notorious LSD-induced adverse effect involved a lethal experiment on Dr. Frank Olson, a scientist doing classified research at Fort Detrick. An enormous amount has been written about the case, but I'll focus on what the CIA did and how they dealt with the situation afterwards. On November 19th, 1953, Olson and his colleagues attended a CIA retreat. Sidney Gottlieb spiked the attendees' Cointreau with LSD, and Olson had a severe adverse reaction. He became agitated and depressed, felt that people were making fun of him, and thought that he'd made a fool of himself. He returned home and for the next few days continued to feel these symptoms. His wife then took him to CIA headquarters. The agency flew him to New York to consult with Dr. Abramson. That evening, Abramson made a house call to the Statler Hotel where Olson was staying, and Olson returned to see Dr. Abramson in his office the next day. Abramson thought Olson would calm down if he went home for Thanksgiving, and the agents flew him back to New York. Unfortunately, he decompensated so badly that they flew him back to New York for another consultation with Abramson. They met again, and Olson agreed that he would admit himself as a voluntary psychiatric patient to Washington's Chestnut Lodge Hospital the next day. Olson returned to the Statler Hotel, accompanied by CIA watchers, but he fell to his death from his hotel room on the 10th floor of the hotel that night. There has been uncertainty whether it was an accidental fall, a suicidal jump, or a murderous push. His son believes he was pushed out of the window because the CIA felt he was a security risk. Today, it's unknowable to know whether he jumped, fell, or was pushed. Regardless, the LSD dosing was covered up by the agency, and the agency made up a cover story alleging that Olson had a prior history of mental illness and that the suicide resulted from the mental illness. The events behind Olson's death were kept from his wife and children for 20 years. The agency didn't tell the family about the covert LSD dosing, but merely reported that he'd fallen or jumped, ostensibly in confusion or agitation. The Olson family learned about his surreptitious drugging years later when the CIA's secrecy was pierced by revelations of other human brainwashing disasters in Canada, it seemed the agency couldn't help itself from asking questions like, how are memories shaped and erased? How could LSD be a useful probe for memory retrieval or destruction? Much of this work culminated in a disastrous set of studies in Montreal. The Canadian MK Ultra studies made their way into fiction in Robert Ludlum's books and movies about Jason Bourne. According to Ludlum, the CIA had taken a young man to a special institution where a kindly psychiatrist wiped all memories from his brain and then reprogrammed him to become Jason Bourne, the consummate assassin. The fact is, aside from the business about becoming a consummate assassin, it's all true, and it's based on events in Montreal under the aegis of Cornell's social ecology program and the CIA. The psychiatrist's name was Ewan Cameron. In 1951, intelligence officers met with psychologist Donald Hebb to ask what he thought about brainwashing in Korea. He theorized that brainwashing was facilitated by sensory isolation. When people are deprived of sensory inputs, they don't think clearly and they become susceptible to persuasion. The Institute was intrigued about this and asked him to flesh this in. Hebb continued, by cutting off all sensory stimulation, the individual could be led into a situation whereby ideas might be implanted. He rapidly received funding for secret studies on sensory deprivation. He recruited healthy young people, put them in a small experimental chamber where they were isolated from all experimental stimuli. The idea was to study them for 6 weeks, but most of the subjects couldn't stand it for more than 2 or 3 days. These observations on perception weren't particularly interesting to the intelligence agency, but the agency grew very attentive when Hebbs explained that isolation might make people more suggestible. They placed subjects in isolation chambers and tried to interest them in all kinds of things, tapes promoting dental hygiene, or discouraging smoking, or tapes that discussed poltergeists. When subjects had nothing else to do in the chamber but listen, they became quite absorbed, and even after the experiments concluded, remained interested in those topics. Meanwhile, across town, Ewan Cameron was appointed as the founding director of Montreal's Allen Institute of Neuropsychiatric Research. With considerable startup funding, the Allen Institute was endowed with faculty positions, laboratories, and a clinic on the edge of McGill's campus. All were housed in this rather intimidating limestone mansion called Ravenscrag. The building lived up to its ominous appearance under Dr. Cameron's leadership. He was a vocal advocate for improved treatment of mental illness. He grew up in Scotland, the son of a stern Presbyterian minister. He obtained top-notch training and moved to Manitoba, where he began writing papers. He loved new gadgets and was ready to try anything to help his patients. Dehydration therapy, heat therapy, exposure to red light, cod liver oil, carbon dioxide inhalation, the ketogenic diet. None of these were particularly efficacious, and his methods were decidedly imprecise. He introduced insulin therapy in North America and deliberately induced comas for multiple hours and repeated the process for up to 50 days when he treated severely ill psychiatric patients. Nonetheless, he found that this intensive therapy was dangerous and not effective. He concluded that insulin didn't work because he was treating people too late in their illness. His colleagues paint a complex picture of him. He was described as warm, distant, dedicated, evil, heroic, pathological, vindictive, and fair almost to a fault. He was impatient with the slow course of psychotherapy and thought things would proceed more efficiently if he could start with a blank slate. Cameron's idea was that old memories were troublesome and should be obliterated with ECT, insulin coma, and LSD. Once this was accomplished, he believed the solution lay in prolonged sleep therapy and sensory deprivation, supplemented by psychic driving. What does that mean? Repeated messages played back to the person over a tape loop. Perhaps one might be more tolerant of his efforts if he'd focused only on severely mentally ill patients who had failed all treatments and been relegated to custodial care, or on patients who knowingly volunteered for this extreme treatment. But Cameron treated everybody. Housewives with mild anxiety and depression, executives with anxiety, alcohol. Tucked away in this foreboding fortress, he set up a ghastly assembly line where he thought he would conquer mental illness. Meanwhile, his reputation flourished. He became president of the American Psychiatric Association and advocated for improvement in treatment of mental illness. And he talked about his innovative approach to obliterate memories. He came to the attention of Harold Wolff and the CIA Director Dulles. Again, serendipity. Dulles's numerous extramarital affairs had created problems with his wife. Mrs. Dulles was disconsolate about these constant affairs, and the CIA suggested that she meet with Dr. Cameron to see whether his special treatments in Montreal might help her forget her husband's dalliances. She declined his treatment. Dulles was enchanted by Cameron's ideas about LSD and ECT because they seemed to promise a quick way of shaking up the enemy. Cameron treated mental illness with every tool available. What he did differently was to use all of these interventions to excess, to cloak the interventions in a scientific veneer and remain blind to the failures. He advocated for ECT, but in very high doses. If some ECT is good, then more ECT must be better. And furthermore, the memory disruptions, which were side effects of ECT, were actually one of the goals of Cameron's approach. He administered hundreds of doses of electroconvulsive therapy to some patients and supplemented with insulin coma. Once ECT had destroyed memories and regressed patients back to their infancy, he thought it would be a simple matter to reprogram them. He used all kinds of drugs simultaneously, amphetamines, barbiturates, LSD. Typically, patients would be receiving 5 or 6 doses simultaneously. Patients didn't have a choice. At the start of the 20th century, sleep therapy with sedatives became popular. The approach was based on observations that agitated patients improved after sleep, and that sleep provided some respite or oblivion from mental suffering. So patients were sedated for 2 weeks at a time with transient awakenings for toileting and feeding. It was a risky business because of risks of pressure sores, pneumonia, pulmonary embolism. At Cameron's Allen Institute, the sleep was maintained. Patients were wakened, fed, toileted, and then sedated again to resume their long-term sleep, 20 hours a day for 3 weeks. Cameron had no patients in psychotherapy. Early on, he started taping sessions with his patients, editing and abstracting what he believed to be the crucial tidbits and playing them back for his patients to study. He required them to write out their thoughts about the tapes and bring the journals to the sessions. He called this automated psychotherapy. And years later, he called it psychic driving. Gradually, he started linking all of these steps together: memory ablation with LSD and convulsive therapy, sleep learning, psychic driving, into one huge toxic cocktail. He became enamored with linguaphone, a device that purported to teach foreign language during sleep. The company pushed an appealing concept that sleep learning would allow you to reclaim a third of your life for self-improvement. Cameron saw an advertisement for the device and thought it would be a powerful tool for psychiatric brainwashing. He broadcast tape recordings through pillows while patients slept and through a helmet while patients were awake. He was convinced that by playing the appropriate messages, he could change his patients' thoughts. He called these tape loops dynamic implants. The CIA was absolutely enchanted by the process. The patients didn't like it. And Cameron found that he could get better compliance by playing tape loops while the patients slept and while they were on drugs. He acquired more experience, pushed the dose higher and higher, had psychic driving imposed 20 hours a day for 10 to 15 days with patients in a quasi-sensory isolation. One of Cameron's colleagues recalled a patient forced to listen to, "No, it's not true that my mother-in-law is trying to poison me. She's a very warm person." Maybe that sounds like a sensible message to emphasize, but Cameron had other ideas. He thought defenses had to be torn down before a new constructive message would take root. A woman admitted for postpartum depression had to listen to this tape. "Do you realize that you're a very hostile person? Do you know you're hostile with the nurses? Do you know you're hostile with the patients? Why do you think you're so hostile? Did you hate your mother? Did you hate your father?" He would go on with repetitions 250,000 times. The CIA funded him promptly, and his proposals were succinct and reviewed rapidly and approved. Cameron was sure he was helping patients. The data looked good to him. His charts and tables, however, had no real foundation. It's not that he falsified records, he just disregarded any evidence to the contrary. He made every kind of mistake that contemporary clinical trials are designed to forestall. He was inconsistent in his diagnoses, inconsistent into his eligibility. If patients didn't respond to the study, he dropped them from the study and claimed that he'd never studied them at all. When psychological tests gave the wrong answer, Cameron simply overruled them, saying that his clinical experience counted. The goal was to erase patients' memories and bring them back to a regressed state where they were incontinent and unable to take care of themselves. Then patients would be changed by psychic driving. Everybody would agree that Cameron was successful in his first aim, regression. The problem was that patients were left with vast chunks of their memory obliterated. As to the second goal, implanting new ideas via psychic driving, it wasn't clear that that worked. Despite his claiming success, people started having doubts. The CIA cut his funding. Science really depends upon keeping an open mind. Resolute and to the end, Cameron couldn't conceive that he might be wrong. He recognized neither his faulty research nor its flawed ethics. When he retired, a committee was formed to evaluate the program. The hospital compared 79 of his patients who received psychic driving and compared them with other patients treated around the same time. There was little to suggest that Cameron's intervention achieved the glowing success that he had claimed. More importantly, many of Cameron's patients reported that they couldn't recall vast swaths of their lives. Cameron died suddenly in 1966, but it took another 10 years before the scandal blew up and the lawsuits started. Lawyers obtained Cameron's proposal to MK Ultra and traced the funding to the CIA. Those CIA connections infuriated people, but ultimately it was Cameron's application itself that was so damning. He wrote, "The breaking down of ongoing patterns of patient behavior by means of particularly intensive electroshock, supplemented by intensive repetition of the pre-arranged verbal signal during which the patient is kept in partial sensory isolation and then placed into continuous sleep for 7 to 10 days. With this
Sorry,
unmoving...
Dr. Dimsdale, I'm sorry to interrupt. I could listen a long time to you.
I have one more minute if you have to run.
Okay, I think we can go on a little, but some people will have to log off. So please.
So what have we learned? The purportedly simple connection between popular culture experimentation and psychedelics and contemporary research has a backstory. That history demonstrates that the goals of researchers and funders are not necessarily shared, and that conviction about a state of emergency can lead to bad decisions regarding research ethics.